So just a minute. Okay, great. So, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Courtney from Stateless. I'm a product developer and production manager. Stateless is an outsourced design, development, and production team based in New York. We work with brands big and small across the world. We have a partnership with Makers Row and now also Embark Live. You can find our product team on Makers Row and our branding team on Embark Live. Our Makers Row link is pinned here. You can check us out on Makers Row. For those of you who aren't familiar with Embark Live, sorry, I'm also dealing with construction in this building, so we're going to just deal with it. It's the New York COVID life. Anyway, so Embark Live, for those of you who aren't familiar, where Makers Row is where you go to find people to help you make your product. Embark Live is connects you to connects you as the entrepreneur to business professionals in the fashion world who can help you with things that are non-product based, like sales, accounting, branding, like our team, things of that nature. So be sure to sign up if you haven't already. Today, we're going to talk about a very important subject, pre-production. This is the transition between sampling and production. So feel free to ask questions throughout, and I'll also stop to answer between segments. If you've watched the other lives I've done, you can hear me say this over and over again. Clean development makes for clean production. So in other words, if your sampling is sloppy, your production is going to be a mess. And to be honest, even when sampling is organized, production is a lot. Domestic production especially is a lot. And the smaller the quantities, the more work you have in your hands as the brand owner. So even when you have really clean sampling, or we call it product development, but in the sample phase, even if you're really, really buttoned up there, production is hard, and you just need to do this pre-production phase to just make sure that your T's are crossed and your I's are dotted. Okay. Now that you've finished your samples, what are your next steps? Firstly, you want to check your tech packs, which includes the sketches, the bill of materials, or what we call the BOMs, and the specs to make sure that they reflect the current sample. Updates to your sketch, your BOMs, and your specs should be done throughout the development process, but now would be a really good time to comb through everything and make sure that nothing was missed. Inevitably, even with a really, really tight ship, you can miss some things. There might be a change that happened that the factory did without you putting it in the BOM during a fitting, for example, and you like it, so you need to add that in. And from that, just in case you aren't familiar, we already talked about it before, but BOMs, a quick refresh, BOMs are the bill of materials, which is like a recipe for your clothes. It documents all of the ingredients, so to speak, that go into making each specific garment. Sketches are pretty straightforward. I think everyone knows what that is, but it should have all of your call outs. If you move the pocket, you need to move it on your sketch. If you move the pocket in a fitting. But specs are the measurements built to guide the pattern maker. Not everyone works with specs, but please go watch some of my previous live streams to learn why we at Stateless highly recommend using specs. But the short answer is you need to make sure your samples come out as accurate as possible. And the best way to do that is to provide as much direction as possible. So specs really help. Otherwise, you spend a lot of time and money on samples that that don't really look the way you intended them to, and they don't fit the way you intended them to. So also, just for your reference, there are archived live streams from everybody who's done this through Makers Row on Facebook, so you can check it out. I might reference something that I've talked about before. Feel free to go find me talking about it at length there. Okay. So good. So far, no questions. Great. All right. So once you're done doing that, right? Once you're done making sure that all of your documents themselves match your final fit samples. Oh, I should mention too that pre-production, that means that you've all of your samples are fit approved. You're done with your samples. You're ready to move into production. There might be some small changes, what we call C&P or correct and proceed. There might be if we were like, we want to bring this neckline in, this collar in a 1/4 inch on each side. We don't have to see a new sample for that. We can just have the pattern maker adjust that before going into production. But the idea is that you're done with all of your samples. Everything's fit approved or with CNP. And you're now preparing to go action. So once you're done checking all of your documents and making sure that they all match your samples, you want to review your patterns and your cutter's musts. On the West Coast, I'm from the West Coast, and we called them pattern cards. And then when I moved to New York, we call them cutter's musts here. So you might hear that those two words, they're interchangeable. Checking your patterns is a pretty difficult task for somebody who doesn't know what to look for. That's when people like us come in, where we know how to do that. But so what you're looking for is you're not going to like walk the pattern and make sure that the sleeve fits the armhole. Like, we already sampled. You know that that's been done. What you're looking for is you're looking to make sure things like, let's say we're doing a sample right now where they keep forgetting the zipper guard underneath this thing. So I would double check to make sure that the zipper guard pattern piece is in the pattern. And it looks like this. And you can look on the cutter's mustard pattern card and it'll say like number 7, zipper guard. And I can go and I can search through, even if I didn't know what a pattern really was, I could go and I could potentially search through the cutter's must, find page or piece number 7 and say, okay, it is present. The zipper guard is present. They just keep forgetting to cut it, right? So, but what the cutter's must is, it's essentially, it should match your BOM. And the cutter's must is made by the pattern maker. And it lists, this shirt's pretty simple. So there's only one fabric. So it lists all of your different pattern pieces using each type of fabric. In addition to that, it calls out if there's like elastic, we're making a bodysuit, elastic at the leg hole opening is 1/4 inch. They'll tell you how long it should be. They give all of the information on the cutter's must as to what goes into the sample. You check your cutter's must against your BOM to make sure that they match. If the cutter's must is missing some little things like your labels, things like that, like they usually do count your snaps and things like that, but there are going to be some materials that your pattern maker doesn't put on the cutter's must that do go in your BOMs, but all of the actual fabrics and trims themselves should be reflectant on both documents. Sorry, they're now sawing. All right, so you also want to allocate your yields so that you can calculate both your costs and your production materials. Your yields are based off of the pattern and the fabric widths. So fabric width is a concept that you might not be familiar with by hearing about it, but if you think about it, like if you imagine the New York garment district or LA's fashion district, and you see those stores that have rolls of fabric sticking out of like a box, how tall that fabric roll is, that's the fabric width. Because when you lay it down on a table, that's how wide the fabric is. Most fabrics are somewhere between 55 and 60 inches wide. There are silks and Japanese fabrics in particular that can be narrow, like 44 inches. If you were really good in your sampling phase, you kind of already know that, because especially like if you're making plus size or you're doing something where the width if you're working with a narrow fabric where you have to work around the width of the fabric, that information should be put into your BOMs from the beginning. But here's your chance. You don't always do it right away. Here's your chance to make sure you have all of those widths. You need to give your fabric widths back to your pattern maker or your cutter or your factory if you're working with a full package factory. And you need to ask them for your yields. So based on, like, if I'm making this shirt, let's say this fabric in this colorway is 57 inches wide, but I have a different Japanese cotton version that is the same exact pattern, but it's 44 inches wide. Those two fabrics are going to have different yields, even though it's the same style, even though it's the same pattern. So you need to get that information. And again, your yields inform both your cost and how much fabric you need to order for production. Okay, I'm just going back to my cheat sheet here. So from here, what you should do is you take your BOMs, you make sure you have all of your production costs for all of your materials put into your BOMs, and then you also keep your yields in your BOMs. Ideally, when you're assigning fabrics in the beginning part of your sampling phase, you're actually putting all of that information into your BOM anyway, the price per yard for samples, price per yard for production, how wide the goods are, the content. You need to go get the care instructions, all of that information. It's your time right now to just button it up, take your materials, and make sure you have all the data you need. Care information is really important. We had a client who approved a fabric, a beautiful fabric. I love the fabric. We use it all the time. But she didn't ask or say to us, like, hey, I don't want this to be a dry clean only product. And the fabric approved was dry clean only. And it wasn't until, because we handle a lot for on behalf of brands, it wasn't until the very end when she got her production and she was like, oh, I wanted this to be able to be machine washable. And it's like, well, your fabric has the care instructions that it comes with. So it's if that's an important thing to you, make sure that you vocalize that from the beginning, because if you want everything to be machine washable, it could be that we could have washed those garments or something, done a test to make sure that her customer could wash them. But the fabric care instructions come from the mill, not from us, not from anybody else. And they're predetermined. It's based on how the fabric reacts. So you want to get all of that information up front. I'm going to go to questions for a minute just to see. I don't see any on YouTube or Facebook. So I'm going to go through. I think I saw a couple questions here. Do you work with women's footwear? What is the map for pre-production for footwear? We do footwear. It's similar. We're mostly focused on apparel, so this conversation is an apparel conversation. But BOM sketches and your specs and your tech packs apply to any kind of product. I mean, even in the medical industry, my mom worked in the medical industry when I was a kid. They use BOMs. So anybody that makes something uses a bill of materials. So you want to make sure that basically once you're done sampling, that you look at your sample and you make sure that all of the details that are present in that sample are present in documents, and that they're present on this, what you wanted is present on the sample, because that's what your production is going to look like. A lot of people just skip over pre-production. It's a real step. It's not just like, it's not like you just finish your samples and then you give your patterns to the factory. Like you, the brand owner, and us at Stateless, and part of our process, we are responsible for double checking everything in between to make sure that what you're making, what you're passing back to the factory for production is ready to go and isn't going to be messy. I'll give you a little anecdote and then I'm going to go back to the conversation. I worked for a brand that, they were cool. They were really loose though, the way that they developed samples. And the owner was a designer and knew how to sew and stuff. So he would go and he would just put like a cord end on a pair of pants. Like he'd just put like a plastic cord end on the sample during market. Like we would be showing to a store and he would just go and put a cord in because he thought it looked cooler. And then they would like Photoshop it in later. It didn't get put into the BOM. It didn't get ordered for production. Now I have production done and we're looking at the sample and we're saying, wait, the factory's like, wait, you didn't send us the cord ends. And I'm like, well, because earlier we didn't have the cord ends. So these little tiny things like that, you just have to stop. And we had already done our pre-production in that case. Like they were selling the samples and the owner put some cord ends on this pair of pants because he thought it looked cooler and forgot to mention to all of us. But because of the way there's a domino effect of like communication, those cord ends were from Japan and they took like 3 weeks. So we couldn't get them. We weren't going to delay our production for 3 weeks just for some cord ends. So then we had to go back, take those off the Photoshop samples, and some specific stores, if they had requested photographs or whatever, we had to go and tell those stores, hey, just so you know, your sample you saw had cord ends and they don't anymore. It's just, that's the kind of stuff, that's an easy, fixable, non-nightmarish situation, but there are so many situations like that can happen. Okay, I'm going to keep going to see if there's more questions, and then I'm going to go back to the conversation. Couldn't agree more. Pre-production is crucial. It may seem slower to launch, but one of the best ways to manage your quality. Very true. So quality is what you're after, right? Like there's no reason, I don't get brand owners, and big and small in my past, I don't get people who care more about their deadline than they do about the process. The way you're going to have a successful business is if you make good product. The way you're going to make good product is if you respect the process. The way you respect the process is by doing the steps that need to be taken regardless of the time it takes. Yes, if you're making swimwear or ski wear, the deadline is tough. So start earlier. Give yourself the time to do what it takes. When you talk to experts and they tell you it takes 9 to 12 months from start to finish, from beginning of your design to when you get production on hand, we're not just saying that for fun. It's literally because of the process. And your point of starting a business is to make money. And the way you're going to make money is if you make good product. Okay. So with that said, basically you want to gather all your costs on all your materials, and then you want to make sure that you have the MOQ for the material well. This is especially true for trim and little things, because like labels or elastic, for example, you have to buy a certain amount. So let's say you're only making 500 pieces total. Usually your main labels are going to have a 500 piece minimum. MOQ stands for minimum order quantity. So it's going to have a 500 piece MOQ. You're going to want to buy a little more than exactly 500. If you're making 500 units in production across, let's say you're making 100 pieces and 5 styles, you're going to want to buy the 1,000 labels, you know? So you want to note all of that in your BOMs, the MOQs, things like that. You want to know any little detail like that, because when it comes to your actual like production spend, it's not just a matter of taking your costs and multiplying it by how many pieces you're going to make, because your markers cost extra and you have to buy like extra trim, usually like a 1-inch elastic, 1/4-inch elastic, your main labels. These are things that you can sit on. So it's okay to buy them in bulk. And obviously, if you have the option, if you're only making 300 units and you have the option to buy 500 main labels or 1,000 main labels, you can save the money. You pay a little extra per piece to do 500, but you don't need to sit on 1,000 if you're really like, I'm not going to move through those 1,000 for a while, right? But elastic, for example, if a roll of elastic usually either comes in 30-meter rolls or 50-meter rolls. If you need 110, you're going to have to either buy less and short your elastic, or you have to buy more. So even if you only need 110, you're going to sit on 40 extra yards, right? So you have to make sure you have all of your MOQs in place so that you know what you're going to need to buy. On the other side of costing, you want to make sure that you ask your factories for production costing. In order to cost your stuff, they're going to need to know how many units you're making. Sometimes it's nice to ask for a few different scenarios. Here comes the saw. Let's say you want like 50 units or 100 units. Even if you're only going to make 50, I recommend that you do ask for the cost for 100 units. And the reason is, I've talked about it before in another live, but most often new brands, they have to take a margin hit when they first launch, maybe even for a couple years. But you want to be able to, you're not going to just like name your retail price willy-nilly. You want to know, okay, right now I'm making right now I'm making 50 units, but one day I'm going to make 100. What's my cost when it's at 100 units? How much would I have to sell the product if I had the 100 unit cost to make a 55% margin, so that you can actually like realistically set your prices. I met a brand that I worked with before Stateless who she just made her costs up. She was like, I want the bathing suit to be $120. And then I came in and I did some cost sheets and I was like, okay, we're making like 13% here, because she was making 30 units. So we went and we asked the factory, okay, well, how much would you charge for 50 units? How much would you charge us for 100 units? Sorry, I think I just paused. Sorry. Things like that, so that we could adjust her pricing according to what her actual costs are going to be, right? Okay, so I'm going to go back to see more questions. Is it possible to have an MOQ of 50? Sometimes I'd say that you're better off like it. I would say that's the lowest minimum you can get. In New York, you can make 25 pieces, but you're going to pay an arm and a leg for it. In some of the smaller mom and pop factories in LA, you might find that too. But let's say you're doing a pair of leggings in 3 colors. You can probably get away with 50 pieces per like black and say easier sell like navy. And then you could probably negotiate if you had like a bright teal, something more novelty. You could say like, hey, will you do 25 of this piece? But just so you guys understand how MOQs work, factories they're not just making them up willy-nilly either. Every time they have to change a thread color, it slows them down. So everything in a factory is made in an assembly line, even the smaller like atelier kind of boutique factories. Bigger factories do one sewing process at a time. They'll do like single needle machine, all in one thread color, and then they pass it to the overlocker who has the same thread color, and they do their processes, and then it goes back to maybe the cover stitch person who has the thread color, right? So every time they have to change threads, it slows them down. Every time you have to open a new bundle, which is a different color of the same style, just because it's the same style doesn't mean that it's that it's, the same thing to them because they have to change thread. So I would say your lowest MOQ should be 50, and with a rare exception, don't go lower. You're also just going to pay a lot for it. Let's see. Any other questions? Try to start small, not to go overboard. Agreed. Okay, great. Not too many more. Okay, here we go. What time would you recommend having blocks made? Ooh, someone's punking us. So I'm going to answer that question on YouTube. Blocks. So blocks, we haven't really talked about blocks here. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but when you're a new brand, okay, well, sorry, let me slow down. What are blocks? Blocks are basically like patterns that you can use as almost like a template to build other patterns. So let's say like this is a t-shirt I'm wearing. It's my first season. I'm not going to make a block yet. I'm going to just make this t-shirt pattern. Let's say next season, I want to do the same shirt basically, but cropped. That's when you can start making a block. Your block will be this, and then you make the cropped thing. It's not like you really make blocks ahead of time. You make blocks based on like you let your business informs you on what blocks you're going to make, if that makes sense. Let's see. I like some of these comments here. Okay. Would it be a good idea to have a small MOQ with a factory to see if you like their production quality or test the process? Sorry, no, not my Mile Life. It wasn't you who's punking me. Somebody else is talking about Jesus in the comments. That's who was punking me. Okay, so back to the MOQ with the factory. So if you're not doing your samples with the factory, you don't have to do a small production with them to see whether or not you like their quality. You always need to do a PP sample. Even if you've already gotten your samples fit approved, you have to make a new PP every time you switch factories. So let's say you work with a pattern maker and a sample maker just for your samples, and then you go to a factory and you want to see what they're doing, if they can do it, you have to do a sample to test it. We had a friend introduce us to a factory, just like a colleague introduced us to a factory, and we sent a couple patterns to them to see if they could do the activewear that they said they could do, and it was terrible, and we would never work with them. And we did that just to like test them out with just a pattern we had. But that's basically the process you'd be using if you were looking for a factory. Okay, let's see. So there's more questions here. Oh, I hate it when it does that. Sorry, guys. Okay, so I have done 2 samples of my 8-unit collection. The shop went bankrupt. I would like to finish my product. Can I do 100 units of each in the US eco-friendly fabric? Yes. So right now it's a rough time, right? There's a lot of places going under. You've done 2 samples out of your 8. If you want to do production on those 2, you can go into production on them small. 100 units is a good order. Even on 2 styles, 100 units is fine. You're going to get a good cost on it. And then for your other 6 samples that you haven't gotten through yet, I would recommend working with that factory to do those samples if you like them, the new factory that you're going to do production with. Some factories don't have an in-house pattern maker, so you have to figure out how you would do that. But yes, I would recommend trying that. That's great. Who does samples for a photo shoot, and how many samples should I have in general? So we talked about this. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I will answer this question. So you do your proto sample. It's probably going to be not that cute. It's going to be cut up, maybe marked, pinned, blah, blah, blah. It's not going to fit right. Then you have your second fit sample. We work with one factory that by the second fit, because we've been working with the same brand and the same factory and the same team for years, almost always they nail the second fit. That's super rare. And that just speaks to the fact that we should, that it's great to have this industry is about relationships. It's all about relationships. You need to treat your factories like your family. The people who work with you, they're the experts, and it's a long-term game. So this factory in particular at second fit nails the samples. We barely have to do any third fit samples, but most of the time, new brands, they change their styles so much. I make this shirt this time, and the next time I make a shirt that has the shoulder seam way down here, the factory might not get you. So it's not like other factories are bad for not nailing it. It's that this brand in particular is really, really consistent, and we've been consistent with the factory. So it's worked out. But the short answer is you do 3 fit samples, and then you have your photo samples or salesman samples. Usually you only do your fit samples in one colorway, and then if you have additional colorways, you do that at salesman sample set. If you have a PR firm or a showroom, you might want to have one set for your showroom, one set for you, and one set for your PR firm in your whole collection. Or you might just identify for your PR firm, here's the styles I really want to push. We're going to get you these extra samples. But usually if you have a showroom to sell, then yeah. Same if you're an e-commerce brand, you might also still have PR. You don't have a showroom, but you have PR, and you might want to have dupes just in case. Like I have a small brand, and I always have dupes because if something's popular, like, one magazine pulled it and somebody else wants it at the same time. So 7 said their favorite quotes of the Courtney quotes of the day: respect the process. And then the second quote of the day is respect the people. That's right, everybody. Okay, so I see a lot of questions. I'm going to answer them in just a little bit, but I'm going to keep going so that I don't get derailed. I have a little bit more to talk about, and then I'll keep answering your questions. Okay. So once you have all of your costs on your material and labor, it's time to do your cost sheets. We talked about this before too, but I'll quickly review it. In order to calculate your costs, you need to take all of your materials and your BOMs, and you multiply the cost of those materials by those materials' yields. Then you add up all of your separate material costs multiplied by their yields together, and you get your material costs, your total material costs. Then you take all of your labor. Let's say there's cutting, sewing, embroidery, finishing. You take all of those costs per product, you add them together. You have your total labor cost. Then you take your material cost and your labor cost, you add them together, and that's your total product cost. Now, these spreadsheets that I build for costing, I just did one over the last few days. It took me about 7 hours. They're big. I mean, this brand also had 44 styles, but it's detailed. It's a lot. And this time during this pre-production time is when you're like, oh, we said we were going to make a new label for just this one pair of pants. We got to put that on our to-do list. Cue the designer. Oh, we haven't worked through this strike off yet for this print. We need to figure out how that's going to fit into our time and action. So during this costing and pre-production process is how it cues you to what else you have left to do, because it's never usually like you're completely done at one point, It cues you what you have left to do in development. It cues you what costs you still need to get. And it just makes sure that you have all of your cost charts are really, really, really important. They're hard to do though. So hit us up if you want help with that, because I don't know how people do. I mean, I've worked at other brands where I was just the production manager and their costs were pretty loose. Like they just kind of guessed their costs. But that's not really a good business model. Okay. So once you have your total product cost, if you're e-commerce, you just multiply that by 2 times, maybe 2.2 times, and there you have it. Now, we just had a client recently ask, hey, this brand who's a lot like mine, how come they're almost double the price? The reason is that brand also does wholesale. So when you do wholesale, which means you want to sell to stores, you have to mark up your product cost 2 times. So what you do first to get your wholesale cost, you mark that up by 2 or 2.2 times, and that's your wholesale price. Then to get your retail price, you add another markup of 2 or 2.2 times. So that's why, like Everlane, for example, they're a direct-to-consumer brand. They're almost like half the price of Vince, but Vince sells to Nordstrom's, so they're kind of similar products, but Everlane doesn't have to mark it up as much because they don't sell to stores. Okay, so yeah, we're gonna run out of time, and I want to answer your questions, but I'm gonna just finish by talking about the final steps before production. You've got to get your markers made, you got to get them graded, and you've got to order fabrics. So let's start with markers. Your markers are like blueprints, or they're like a jigsaw puzzle. They take your pattern pieces and they lay them out for production cutting. The marker maker, does your grading to make all of your sizes. So you only sample in one size if you're doing like a straight size range. Or if you're doing children's or plus size, you might sample in 2 sizes to make sure that, I'll explain that another time, but the math is too hard. You can't just like sample in a size small and go all the way up to a size 32 in plus size. You have to sample like a small and like a 1X or a 2 and an 18 or something like that, so that your grade works. So they take your pattern and then they grade it. You can either ask your marker maker to just apply a standard grade rule, or you can, provide specs. At Stateless, we provide specs. And with children's wear in particular, and with plus size, and especially like a wide range of sizes, we do often do custom grading. So if you need your size 4 to fit X specs, and you need your size 18 to fit X specs, based on the client saying, or you, the brand owner, saying, I want to fit like Eileen Fisher. We're going to look at that size chart, and we're going to say, okay, well, this size 2 fits like this, and this size 18 fits like this. We have to custom grade to do each size in between. Okay, so markers. Markers are made to the width of the specific fabric they're meant to cut. So again, my example earlier about this shirt, this one's a 57-inch fabric, and then I've got a Japanese cotton that's 44 inches. I have to make 2 markers, even though it's the same pattern. You do not want to use the 44-inch marker on this one because you're going to have 20 inches of wastage. So you make it specific to each fabric. And if you're making like a shirt that has like 5 different fabrics on it, each marker has to be made according to its width. And again, that's why the yield is so important. The yield is calculated based on, yield means consumption. It's how much fabric it consumes. So depending on how wide the fabric is, you can lay the more pattern pieces on a wider fabric, right? So when you go to give your marker maker your marker request, you give them your grade rule, and you give them the roll widths for each fabric. Then you send your patterns with your cutter's musts, and then they make the markers based on all of the different roll widths. But you want to remove 1 inch from the roll width, because you'll see if you look at a color card of fabric, it'll say 57 inches and then it'll have a slash and say 60. That means that if you get a 60-inch wide fabric or you get a 57-inch wide fabric, it's within tolerance. So you're going to want to make your markers 56 inches wide, right? Just to accommodate for that waviness, because it's not like sheet metal with steel where you can like laser cut it exactly perfect, right? The fabric is going to, in some parts of the roll, it's going to be narrower than other parts. Okay, so with that said, you remove the inch from the marker width, and then talking about consumption and yields, you want to, when you go to use your yields to order materials, you have 2 options. If you have time, and then cue the saw. If you have time, you can do your markers first, and that'll give you the truest yield possible. It's your production yield. Markers are laid out with like if this is a sleeve and this is the body, like it could be laid out like this. If they share the same, like if the jigsaw can cut right in between, they will be laid out that way. Whereas sample making, they'll lay the sleeve here and the body here, So the yields you get from your pattern maker or your factory before making your markers are a little bit inflated. So if you get your yields from the marker maker, they're really accurate, but you still want to add a buffer when you go to order your materials. So when it comes time to ordering your materials, you want to add something like 2% is usually sufficient for fabric and trim. And if you're doing something that has shrinkage, if you're garment dyeing or washing the garments, you might want to order more like 3 or 4% extra. Basically, in this industry, the reason that fast fashion is so wasteful is because 2% extra when you're making 50 pieces is like 1 yard. 2% extra when you're making 3,000 pieces is like a full roll of fabric. There's waste that goes into it, but what you don't want is, it depends. If you have a shortage, let's say you meant to make 50 pieces and you didn't order enough fabric and you're going to be short 4 pieces. If you're an e-commerce brand, it's not as big of a deal. But in my past, before recently, e-commerce wasn't as big as it is now, and we would have a shortage because the yield was wrong or whatever, or certain things like, the mill says that we need 148 yards. We can either order 139 or we can order 160 because we have to get another full roll. So we opt to do the 139 and we're just going to figure it out. So then after they cut it, the factory tells us, oh, you're short 15 pieces. And we have to look, okay, are we going to short our e-commerce, or is there a store we don't care about and we're going to short them? That's why ordering the buffer is so important, because you can't go back and recut. No one's going to go back and cut pieces. They're not going to cut you one piece. No one's going to go back and production is it's a streamlined process, and it's like there's like batch steps. So once you get through cutting, you can't order more fabric. I mean, maybe if there's like 50 piece shortage, you could probably talk the factory into it, but you're going to have to pay for another printout of your marker. You're going to have to pay another cutting table fee. You're going to have to pay all this extra stuff. So you want to just order your buffer so that you don't run out. And ideally over time, except for with novelty fabrics, and that you might want to just order straight to order and just shortage anything that goes short, right? But ideally over time, you can use that fabric next season for a muslin, for one sample, or you're going to reuse that fabric because you like it. Okay. So yeah, I think that's about it for my list. I'll get back to your questions, but to just wrap it up, to remind you, most trim has higher minimums than what you actually need. So when you build your production budget, like I said earlier, you don't just take your cost chart and say, okay, well, my total product cost is X. I'm going to make 50 pieces and multiply it by that. And then at the end you say, okay, $10,000. Because you have to order extra labels, because you have to order extra elastic, because you have to pay for your markers, you're going to want to buffer a good 5% into your dollar amount budget based off your cost chart to account for those extras in your MOQs. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to questions. Let's see. I'm going to go to YouTube. I'm doing 6 samples with 5 sizes. What is the minimum that I can start with per size for a potential factory? So that's another really good point. So if you make a pair of jeans and you want to have like 10 inseam lengths, if you're only cutting like 1 piece per size, the factory is going to charge you a lot. If you cut, you ideally with 50 pieces, we usually use like a 1:2:1 ratio, meaning like for women's wear, you're going to buy, for every 1 extra small, you're going to buy 2 smalls and 2 mediums. And for every 1 large, you're going to buy the 2 smalls and 2 mediums. Same with menswear. You still usually do a 1:2:1 ratio, but you usually do a 1:1:2:1. So it goes like maybe even less on the smalls, right? And then maybe 1 on the mediums, and then large and extra large, you usually buy a little more. It depends on your customer. I've worked with a lot of brands who sell to Japanese stores. So even in menswear, size smalls, we buy a lot more size smalls. And, when stores are like really good customers, we might even buy extra to let them reorder. And, so we'll make like more extra smalls and smalls on the women's side and more smalls and mediums on the men's side for the Japanese market. So it really depends. But you definitely want to make sure, like, if you're going to do your size curve and you see that you're making 2 pieces in one size, the factory's basically doing you a favor if they don't complain. And that's not what they want to do. They don't want to cut 2 pieces in one size. Obviously, if you're doing a large order and you just want to offer like in plus size, for example, we'll just do like a size 32. There might not be that many customers that buy a high-end brand size 32. So we'll make 2 or 3, just to make sure that the representation is there, that there are customers that are being served, but so that you don't have to, risk sitting on inventory on a size that you're not sure if your customer exists. So, but yeah, if we're making 15 pieces in the main size, then it's okay to do 3 or 4 there. So I hope that answers your question. Next question, do you use Excel for your costing sheets, Microsoft projects, or some other proprietary template? Honestly, Google Docs or Google Sheets or Excel is perfectly fine. I mean, I'm an Excel nerd. I run pivot tables. I do like all kinds of stuff in Excel. You don't need any sort of proprietary calculating program until you're really big. But you want to be able to be really good at Excel. And the one thing, like when I was making my cost chart yesterday, you want to have you have to be almost robotic. Like if I'm saying a 1-inch elastic, I have to type it the exact same way every time so that when I go to calculate my materials, It's not like it's telling me I need to get 1-inch elastic that had like a dash in it and I need to get 50 yards of that one. And then another one that says 1-inch elastic in all caps lock and it's I need 120 yards of that one. It's like messy. So whatever materials, if they're the same materials, you want to have it written in your Excel file the exact same way. Can you give an example of what the cost per unit would be if it's 100 versus 300 units, and what would the retail price be? Sure. So I'm just going to give an example of a pretty standard made in Los Angeles. Your cutting fee is going to be $200 no matter how many pieces you make. So it could be at $2 per piece, or it could be $4 per piece, depending on how many units you make. The more units you make, the lower your price is going to be. So you have that fee. And then your sewing, let's say you do 50 pieces of a regular tank top, just a pretty basic, like even like just a, not even spaghetti strap, just a regular old tank top. Let's say you do 50 pieces. That sewing could be like, don't quote me on this, I'm just giving you an example. That could be like $15 sewing. If you want to put a heat transfer on it and have a finishing house pack it and do special stuff to it, maybe another 75 cents. So your total product cost for 50 units might be $15. And then if you do 100 units, it might be $13, for example. Okay, now I'm going to answer more questions on Instagram. Let's see. I'll make sure, wow, there's like a lot of questions. Okay, so I can't find a factory that is willing to do less than 500 pieces. What do you suggest for a startup who doesn't know how many? 500 pieces is a lot. I would not do that, not unless you have a lot of capital. 500 pieces, think about it this way. I'm really bad at mental math, so I'm gonna just pull up my calculator. Let's say the question from YouTube about the tank top, let's say it's $15 a piece, all in, times 500. That's $7,500 for one style. If you have a 5-piece collection, that's a lot of money. You don't want to make 500 units unless you have a lot of money to put into PR and marketing and you know that you're going to sell through that really fast. I mean, obviously, if you're doing something simple, like there's a lot of really cool little brands that are coming out right now who do like underwear. There's this brand called Parade that I've been like enjoying. I don't know who the owner is. But if you're doing something where it's like 3 silhouettes across a couple colorways, you can get away with, it's underwear. So maybe you can move through 500 to 700 units of that a lot easier than a fashion piece. But you want to start small, and you definitely don't want to spend $7,500 on one tank top style. If it was a leather jacket, okay. Okay, let's see what else we got. I have done, to answer your question, look on Makers Row. There's plenty of mom and pop factories who work with smaller minimums. When you work with full package factories, that's when you're going to get really high MOQs. And that's because they're providing a service and that needs to be worth it for them. But if you have like a well-versed team like us at Stateless, and we have our own network of factories, or you go to a mom and pop factory that you found on Makers Row, you're going to do a lot of trial and error if you don't work with experts like us, but you'll be able to get lower MOQs for sure. 500 is a lot. Okay. I have done 2 samples of my 8-unit collection. Oh, we already talked about that. Sorry, I skipped that question before. What samples do you do for photos? Oh, I already did that question too. Sorry, guys. One sec. You want to work with us, please find us on Makers Row. Do you know how much samples typically cost per size? Okay, so you usually only sample in one size. Your samples are going to be anywhere but that are maybe like 2 to 3 to 4 times more than your production price. So if your $12 tank top that we just talked, $15 tank top that we just talked about, it's probably going to be, your sample is probably going to be $60. For example. So, the main reason that factories do charge extra for samples, there's 2 main reasons. Firstly, it's a lot of work. They're working through the troubleshooting. It's not like you can't just like bring somebody a pattern. And even if you're like knocking off vintage or something, like the sample maker isn't just going to like, oh, look at it and like sew it perfectly. They have to figure out this fabric's different. They have to figure out, oh, this curve is a little weird. It's too thick to do that binding you wanted there. That's why sampling takes 1, 2, 3 times before you get it perfect, because your sample maker is working through the actual construction of it. in addition to your team working on the fit, right? So samples cost a lot because it's a lot more work than when they're just like sewing it and they've already worked through all the kinks. The other reason is that factories are not set up to be personal tailors. This is not like a vanity project where you get to go and just make yourself some cute outfits and call it a sample line. You got to go to a tailor for that. And you're going to pay a lot more from a tailor, right? The factories are doing your samples with the idea, unless they're sample makers, with the idea that they're going to get the production from you. So it's an investment of their time. Factories don't make money off samples. They really don't. They sometimes even lose money because of how much work it takes to work through the stuff. But that's why they had to go and make at least 50 pieces, not 25. Let's see what else we have. Do you do fit samples only in one size or multiple sizes? Okay, good question. There's a process called a jump size set. We don't always do it. We do it a lot in kids wear, and we do it sometimes with plus, especially again, like if you're doing from 0 to size 32 for women's. You sample in one size, and your sample size should always be like, it's not just willy-nilly. You want it to be like kind of the 0 of when we go to do the math. Like if you're doing a menswear size small to triple XL, we would probably want to sample in a men's large. If you're doing men's size small to extra large, we just want to sample in a medium because that'll help us do the math with grading. But if you want to double check that triple extra large fits well, you can then, after you're done with all of your development process, then you do your jump size set, which, sorry, I got cut off again. You do your jump size set, which it's a little tricky because you have to already grade the patterns. And if you need to adjust that 3XL, you're going to have to regrade the patterns. So it's a huge investment. But again, if you want quality product and you want to retain customers, and especially if that's your market, that you really want to make sure that you get the big and tall man, you definitely want to check that jump size set and you just build it into your timeline. But otherwise, you usually just do one sample size. Let's see, more questions, sorry. Do you get pre-sales? How do you know the quantity to start when you don't know the demand? Yeah, that's a hard part. Not a lot of people really go for pre-sales. When you're a new brand, it's really hard to pre-sell. People don't know your stuff. Again, I have a small brand. I'm just now starting to pick up momentum and people are more apt to pre-selling. I've always tried to pre-sell. I offer a discount, but I do wholesale. So there's time to pre-sell. But for most e-commerce brands, what you do is that ratio I just told you, that 1-2-2-1 ratio, you have to kind of you could do a focus group to see what size you think your customer is going to be. But until you have sales data, which is like 3 years in, you kind of are buying based on informed guessing. So there's industry standards, and like for our e-commerce based clients, we will send a suggested size buy. And let's say we're doing a women's wear thing, and there's like, I mean, I'm probably like I'm, I don't know, they call it middle-aged woman. If there's like a brand that has, a cute like 2-piece suit, we're probably going to buy more of that, and we're going to buy more in the larger sizes. But if you make something that's like really skimpy with a lot of cleavage and stuff that maybe mostly younger people will want to wear, usually you're going to buy this like more in the smaller sizes, but you definitely still want to always offer enough in every size. So we'll suggest based off industry standards, but then also tailor it to each style. What is the smallest minimums you've seen? Again, in New York, you can do 30 pieces, but this is going to be like a fur coat. That's something they're charging you like $600 to make. I would say that your common MOQ is 50 units per style, per color. What is your take on starting production of a product in USA then moving overseas after pandemic is over or something down the line? People do it all the time, especially when you grow bigger. That's fine. And what's great is that if you're pricing your stuff off of US made, the great thing about US made is that, well, first of all, I mean, I don't want to get political, but it's just amazing for our domestic economy. But in addition to that, you have a little bit more control and you can start off smaller. And then when it comes to overseas, like factories overseas, you have to really know what you're doing. You can't just like pass a crappy tech pack to a factory overseas and expect to get anything good. You need it to be a really clean situation that you're passing that factory. You need to, it's almost like speaking a different language working with an overseas factory. So you want to be really established, and you want to have like a designer who knows how to do a proper BOM and tech pack on your team. If you're working with overseas. But when you go to move overseas, you do the same thing. You would send them your sample, and you'd say, here's the fabrics, please submit fabrics. And then you'd send them your patterns after you approve the samples and approve the fabrics. And then you'd have them do a PP. It's a completely new style. You'd be passing it to the factory just like you would here, but they would be sourcing the materials for you usually. Unless you're really big, like J. Crew, like when I worked in bigger companies, I would still source materials when we worked overseas because we had the contacts with the mills. But most independent brands aren't going to be that way. You're going to rely on the factory to source the materials for you. So it's a completely different experience, and I wouldn't recommend it without major experts. I'm really a huge supporter of Made in USA, and we can do up to, 3,000 units per style per color. But it's when you're starting to do like, in Vietnam, it's a 10,000 piece MOQ, for example, like for one legging, 10,000 pieces, like you can't work there. So most of the time it's best to start in US. Can you tell us your brand? It's my last name. It's accessories. It's not clothing. Have you found it difficult to get production during this time? We've tried dozens of manufacturers in the USA, and they're not taking new clients. I understand that. I mean, I have personally, and at Stateless, we have really strong relationships with our factories. Some of these people I've been working with for 19 years, they're going to prioritize me. But, they've been working modified hours. Everything is taking way longer right now, and it's just the way it is. I would say that even in normal circumstances, when you're a new brand, if you don't have an in, like with somebody like us who's been working with the factory, you're going to be at the last of the line. They do not care about you. And it's not because they don't care about you. It's that they have all these other clients that it's a well-oiled machine. So they're going to prioritize them, and you're just going to be last on their list. My brand's main focus is printables, but I have 2 to 3 pieces that I'd like to expand into cut and sew with. Do you at Stateless work with brands doing only 2 to 3? Yeah, totally. I mean, we usually try to say 4 styles, but yeah, we can do 2 or 3 styles to help you with. I mean, sometimes we only do 1 style for people. I totally have a 4 o'clock meeting, so I have to go, but I want to keep answering. Sorry. Myrtle, I don't know what your question is. Did I miss your first question? It says, do you feel it'll hurt your branding? You mean, moving overseas? No, I don't think so. I mean, our CEO, Stephanie, whenever she talks to clients, she's always like, we don't recommend at Stateless, we don't recommend for you to be like made in here, because you never know. You might have to change. And obviously if it's part of your brand DNA, like to be a small cottage industry kind of brand that's, only made in USA because you're only doing small quantities. That's okay to then say proudly made in USA, but for the most part, fashion is a global industry, and you want to be able to go wherever you need to go. Also, there's certain reasons, certain stuff can't make it anywhere but India. I mean, there might be some women in Glendale and Los Angeles who can hand bead some little old ladies who will do it for you, but they're going to do 15 pieces. India, the factories are built to make hand beading things. So you want to, made in US is great especially for new brands. But you want to be able to, as much as I support it, and that's my ethos, it's the foundation of everything I do. And that's why I know production so well, is because I've been doing it hands-on forever, which is really rare compared to people who have corporate backgrounds. They've just been passing to factories their whole lives. They don't even know what a marker looks like sometimes. But so I really strongly believe in staying in US, but there are times where it makes sense to move overseas. Typical MOQ in LA, 50 units. Do you own your final pattern in the event you want to move production? You should always make sure that you own your patterns. Yes, 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 yes. You should always own your own patterns. There are some places that don't do that, but just ask up front. It's more common overseas to not own your own patterns. Is Stateless affordable for startups? Yes, we are. Okay, great. I have a couple. I see one more from YouTube. It says 1:2:1 ratio apply to swimwear and water apparel as wear. Yes, yes. I I started in the surf industry, so swim, same thing. Again, like if you're gonna, and that, right now we're in such a liberated time, like any body type can wear your triangle bikini, you know, like this skimpy bikini. So you know, you might want but it depends on your customer. You might still want to buy more in extra smalls in that situation. But if you're doing styles that, it depends on your marketing, right? But a 1-2-2-1 ratio is the standard. And then what I would do from there is actually then just take off your like robot brain after you do your production costing and all of that. You take your robot brain off and you look at it just discerningly and you say, okay, but does it make sense for that one? Probably this style, there's going to be more larges. Probably the style, there's not going to be as many larges, etc. And you tweak it from there. But you use that as kind of your starting point. Great. Okay, so what does retail look like with brick and mortar stores becoming less popular? You mean like, oh, wholesale? Yeah, it's dead. It's really dead. I mean, I'm doing a wholesale market right now. It's super dead. I'm really grateful that I have e-commerce, and I think that it's a really good time to start an e-commerce brand. That's not to say that wholesale doesn't exist. And I think that it would be a huge shame if we didn't have boutiques and cute little mom and pop shops. I could probably do without big giant box stores, but also like when I'm going to just buy like an aunt a birthday present, like it's easier to walk into Nordstrom's, you know, because I can go to the MAC counter or I can get her like a scarf or something, you know? So I feel like there's still room for it in the world. It's just that things are changing at a really rapid pace, but e-commerce is definitely has this huge advantage right now. And I'm just going to mention before I go, I definitely have to go now. No more questions, please. But just remember that if you ever want to do wholesale, I've said this before, but if you ever want to do wholesale, even if you're launching at e-commerce, make sure that you cost it to have wholesale built in, because you'll never make it. You'll never make it to where, unless you start by making 100 units and then you quickly go overseas and get your cost cut, you know, by a third, you're never going to be able to hit your same retail price point without building it in from the beginning to do wholesale. There's my puppy. Okay, so thank you guys so much. I'm not sure, I don't have anything else on the books, but maybe we'll see each other again, and make sure to sign up for Embark Live, check out Stateless at Makers Row, and go into the archive on Facebook and have a look at other stuff I've talked about in the past. Thanks so much. Okay, bye you guys.